The year was 1941, and the continent of Europe bowed beneath the weight of a single flag, the black, white, and red banner of the German Reich. The thunder of boots on cobblestone echoed through cities that had fallen in weeks, sometimes days, to the lightning war that had changed the very nature of conflict. Across the continent, people whispered a word that struck fear into their hearts: Blitzkrieg. To the Germans, it was not just a tactic, it was proof of their superiority, the embodiment of an ideology that had convinced them they were destined to rule. In Berlin, the heart of the empire pulsed with pride. The parades were endless, rivers of soldiers in immaculate uniforms, steel helmets shining beneath the banners of the swastika. Propaganda films blared from theaters, the radio broadcasted triumphant speeches, and the people believed every word. The Führer's voice echoed across the nation like a sermon of fate. "Germany rises again," he proclaimed, and millions cheered, their hearts swollen with pride, their minds clouded by the illusion of destiny. France had fallen in a matter of weeks. Britain, though defiant, was wounded and isolated. The Balkans had been swept aside, and Africa trembled beneath the boots of the Afrika Korps. Europe was a conquered fortress, and the Wehrmacht stood as its master. The generals, their confidence growing into arrogance, began to view war as art, a science they had perfected. They were heirs to centuries of Prussian discipline, masters of movement, precision, and fear. In the great war rooms of Berlin, maps stretched across walls, red arrows sweeping eastward like strokes of divine intent. The generals laughed over cigars, their eyes glinting with certainty. To them, the next campaign was inevitable, the next victory assured. They had conquered the West. Now they would turn east toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the grand design to annihilate Bolshevism, to claim the endless resources and living space of the East. It was a campaign not merely of conquest, but of ideology, of obsession. Hitler saw it as his destiny, the war that would secure the Reich for 1,000 years. And his generals, though some harbored doubts, swallowed his vision whole. They underestimated the vastness of Russia, the endurance of its people, the cruelty of its winters. They saw only a broken, chaotic land ripe for domination. When the date was set, June 22, 1941, the army prepared with almost religious fervor. 3 million soldiers gathered along the border, forming the largest invasion force in human history. The skies above were darkened with the wings of 3,000 aircraft. 3,500 tanks idled, their engines rumbling like beasts eager for release. Every man, every machine, every bullet pointed east. At dawn, the first artillery shells screamed across the border. Villages were consumed in fire. Columns of tanks rolled forward, crushing the earth beneath them. The air filled with the shriek of Stukas diving on their targets, their sirens howling like demons. The Red Army, caught off guard and ill-prepared, reeled under the assault. Communications collapsed, units disintegrated, and chaos swept through the Soviet lines. To the Germans, it seemed like another easy victory. Every mile conquered fed their confidence. Prisoners marched westward in endless columns, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, their faces hollow and defeated. Propaganda officers filmed the scenes, their footage shown in cinemas back home to roaring applause. The newspapers screamed headlines of triumph. "The Soviet Union is finished," declared the Völkischer Beobachter. Even the generals began to believe their own lies. The advance was relentless. Army Group North stormed toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, and Army Group South plunged into Ukraine's rich fields. Cities burned, the skies turned black with smoke, and everywhere the same refrain echoed from German radio: "Victory is ours." In the field, morale soared. Soldiers wrote home, boasting of unstoppable progress. They spoke of the Russian peasants, stunned and terrified, who greeted them with bread and salt, unaware that liberation was not what the Reich offered. Behind the front lines, the SS followed, bringing with them a darkness far deeper than war, a campaign of extermination and terror, hidden beneath the marching drums of victory. By September, the German army had advanced hundreds of miles. Kiev fell, Smolensk was taken, and the road to Moscow seemed open. The generals, flush with triumph, gathered around their maps once more, tracing the final steps of what they believed would be the greatest victory in history. "The Russian bear is finished," one officer boasted. "We'll be in Moscow by Christmas." But whispers of unease began to creep in. The distances were unimaginable. Supply lines stretched thin. Engines broke down in the endless mud. Ammunition dwindled. Fuel ran dry, and the soldiers, once radiant with pride, began to feel the weight of exhaustion. They had not expected the land itself to fight them, the vastness, the cold, the hunger. Still, arrogance drowned doubt. The Germans had never lost, not since the war began. They could not imagine defeat. "Once Moscow falls," the officers said, "the rest will crumble." They ignored the signs, the sudden tenacity of Soviet resistance, the endless reserves of manpower, the sheer will that kept the Red Army fighting even when all seemed lost. As autumn deepened, the rain came, endless, thick, transforming the roads into seas of mud. Vehicles sank to their axles, horses collapsed, and men trudged knee-deep in filth. The advance slowed, but still the orders came. Forward. Always forward. The Russians were retreating, and the Germans, blinded by victory, mistook withdrawal for collapse. In Berlin, the tone was triumphant. Radio broadcasts announced that the Soviet Union was collapsing, that the German soldier was writing history. The people cheered, factories worked day and night, and the illusion of invincibility grew stronger. None could see that the path eastward was not leading to glory, but to ruin. For behind the smoke and victory marches, something had shifted. The Soviet retreat was not chaos, it was a lure. The Red Army, broken but not destroyed, fell back deliberately, drawing the Germans deeper and deeper into a land that devoured armies whole. The further they advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched, the weaker their grip became. Yet the German command, wrapped in arrogance, refused to see it. To them, the war was already won. They believed that the enemy's resistance was futile, that sheer will and steel could overcome any obstacle, even the land itself. The first snows fell early that year, a quiet warning. The soldiers laughed, saying the winter would be short. But the laughter soon froze in their throats as the temperature plunged and the reality of the Eastern Front revealed itself. The enemy was not just the Soviet Union, it was Russia itself, endless, merciless, eternal. Still, the German army marched on, confident that destiny was on their side. In their arrogance, they mistook the calm before the storm for victory. They did not yet know that the same pride that had carried them across Europe would soon drag them into the abyss. For at the height of their power, when the Reich seemed unstoppable and its armies unmatched, the seeds of destruction had already taken root, sown by overconfidence, watered by arrogance, and destined to bloom in blood and ice. And in the east, far beyond the reach of their glory, the storm was gathering. The rains came first, cold, relentless, endless. The proud highways of conquest turned into bottomless swamps of black mud. Trucks bogged down axle deep. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, and men trudged forward knee-deep in filth, their boots sucked at by the hungry earth. The German advance on Moscow, once a lightning-fast spear thrust, slowed to a crawl. The same generals who had laughed over maps in Berlin now stood silent, watching their armies sink, not under enemy fire, but under the sheer immensity of the Russian land itself. Autumn had become a nightmare. The skies were gray, heavy, and indifferent. Every mile forward cost blood. Supply lines stretched so far that fuel arrived days late, if at all. Food was rationed and ammunition had to be hoarded. Still, the orders came from Berlin. Advance. Push forward. The enemy is collapsing. Hitler's words were law, and his delusions lethal. By October, the German army could see the faint outline of Moscow's defenses. The soldiers whispered that victory was near, that one final push would end the war. But even as they whispered, snow began to fall. First soft, like ash drifting from the sky. Then heavier, until the entire landscape was swallowed in white. The great open roads vanished. The fields that had once offered passage to tanks became frozen traps. Engines coughed, sputtered, and died in the cold. Oil congealed like glue. Weapons froze in the soldiers' hands. They were not ready for this. No one was. The Wehrmacht, a machine built for speed and precision, had no winter uniforms. Men wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: curtains, tablecloths, even rags torn from the dead. Their breath hung in the air like smoke. Their fingers cracked and bled. Their faces blackened with frostbite. Still, the command ordered them forward. At first, they thought the Soviets were finished. Every day, they captured more prisoners. Every day, they destroyed more guns and tanks. But the Red Army did not break. It bent, retreated, vanished into the snow, and then struck back like a ghost. The Germans began to fight an enemy they could not see. Snipers picked off officers from treetops. Whole units vanished in the forests, ambushed and slaughtered in silence. And then, as if the land itself had turned against them, the full Russian winter descended. Temperatures plunged below -30. Fuel froze in barrels, and the dead could not be buried. They simply stood where they had fallen, frozen statues on the white plains. The cold was a new kind of enemy, invisible, merciless, undefeated. Inside the trenches, men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat like animals. Food ran out. Bread turned to stone in their hands. Meat became ice. Soldiers gnawed on frozen potatoes or boiled snow just to stay alive. Medical supplies were gone, and those who fell ill, pneumonia, frostbite, gangrene, were left behind to die. The frost claimed more soldiers than bullets ever could. Yet the high command refused to retreat. Hitler's voice thundered across the radio from Berlin. There will be no withdrawal, not one step back. The German soldier does not yield to the elements. He spoke of willpower, of destiny, of overcoming nature through strength. But the man on the front knew better. Nature was not an obstacle. It was a god, and it was angry. Then came the counterattack. In December 1941, when the German lines were stretched thin and brittle, the Red Army struck. From the frozen forests and blizzards they came, divisions of Siberian troops wrapped in white camouflage, hardened by years in sub-zero hell. They moved like phantoms, their rifles steady, their discipline terrifying. The Germans, exhausted and half-frozen, were taken completely by surprise. The assault shattered the illusion of control. The Soviets hit the flanks first, slicing through the overextended positions. Entire regiments vanished overnight. The Germans tried to regroup, to hold their ground. But their weapons jammed, their tanks refused to start, and their commanders were paralyzed by disbelief. The same men who had marched through Paris now crawled through the snow, hunted by an army they had once mocked as inferior. Reports flooded Berlin: panic, chaos, collapse. But Hitler refused to believe them. He raged at his generals, calling them cowards, accusing them of weakness and betrayal. "The will of the Führer is stronger than winter," he shouted. Orders went out to stand firm, to fight to the last bullet, to die where they stood. And they did. Thousands froze in place, rifles clutched in rigid fingers, eyes wide open beneath layers of frost. Entire units were erased by the cold before the Soviets even reached them. Those who survived the first counterattack stumbled backward, dragging wounded comrades on sleds made from doors and tank panels. There was no glory left, only survival. But retreat was forbidden. Every mile lost was declared treason. The army that had been the pride of Europe was now trapped in an impossible paradox. Ordered to hold, unable to fight, condemned to die. Generals like Guderian and von Bock pleaded with Berlin for withdrawal, for reason, for mercy. But Hitler would not listen. He believed he could command the weather, command destiny itself. His arrogance had become madness, and his madness was now the strategy of an empire. As January dawned, the once proud German divisions were barely recognizable. Their tanks were skeletons of steel, their uniforms in tatters. Starved men shivered in dugouts, clutching photographs of families they would never see again. Disease spread faster than the enemy. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, entire limbs. When the Soviets attacked again, there was little resistance. For the first time since the war began, the German army retreated. It was a retreat born not of weakness, but of necessity, an act of survival against the inevitable. Yet even as they fell back, the cost was unbearable. Every step westward was marked by corpses frozen mid-stride, their faces twisted in defiance, disbelief, or simple exhaustion. By spring, what had once been the unstoppable Wehrmacht was a shadow of itself. Hundreds of thousands were dead or missing. Thousands more would never recover from the frost, their bodies crippled forever. The advance on Moscow had failed, the illusion of invincibility shattered. In Berlin, the propaganda continued. Posters declared victory. The radio spoke of strategic repositioning. The Führer still believed that the Eastern Front could be won, that the will of the Reich was eternal. But among the soldiers, a new word had entered their vocabulary, whispered in the dark like a curse: Stalingrad. The winter had taught them something they had never known before: fear. Not of bullets, not of enemies, but of fate itself. For the first time, they realized that their nation's confidence had been a lie, a fragile mask that cracked the moment reality struck. And as the snow began to melt, revealing the frozen corpses of the fallen, one truth stood above all others. The German army had not just met the Russians on the battlefield, it had met itself, its pride, its overconfidence, its delusion, and been defeated by them all. The frost had not merely halted the advance, it had broken the spirit of an empire. And far to the south, a new city's name began to echo through command headquarters, a name that would soon become synonymous with death, pride, and the final unmasking of German arrogance: Stalingrad. Summer returned to the Eastern Front with a deceptive calm. The snow melted into rivers of mud that buried the bones of the dead, and the sun rose again over the endless steppes. The fields sprouted with wild grass, covering the scars of tanks and the frozen corpses of the winter gone by. But behind the illusion of life, the German army was rotting. The soldiers who had survived the Moscow campaign were not the same men who had marched east in triumph. They were thinner, older in spirit, their eyes hollow. They no longer sang the songs of victory. They had seen too much, lost too much. Yet the orders from Berlin came as always, confident, relentless, blind. Hitler had refused to accept defeat in the winter. He told his generals that the Russian campaign was not lost, merely delayed. He promised them glory again, new offensives, new victories. In his mind, the war was a test of will, not of logic. "We will strike south," he declared. "We will seize the oil of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union in half. The Russians are finished." The plan was bold, reckless, and doomed. Operation Blue, they called it. The German army, already stretched to breaking, would divide again. One arm would push into the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus, the other toward a city that was nothing more than a name on the Volga, Stalingrad. At first, the generals questioned the logic. "It's just a city," one said. "Let's bypass it." But the Führer's eyes burned with obsession. Stalingrad, the city that bore the name of his mortal enemy, Stalin, became a symbol. To take it, he believed, would break the Soviet spirit. To lose it, he could not imagine. In August 1942, the assault began. From the skies, the Luftwaffe descended in fury. Thousands of tons of bombs fell on Stalingrad, turning it into a sea of fire. Wooden houses vanished in seconds. Concrete buildings cracked and burned. Civilians died by the tens of thousands. Yet, amid the smoke and ruin, the Soviets refused to flee. They dug in. They swore to fight for every brick. The German Sixth Army, under General Paulus, advanced into the city with confidence. They had conquered everything before. They expected Stalingrad to fall in days. But Stalingrad was not like other cities. It was not a city anymore. It was a graveyard built of steel and dust. The closer they came, the harder the resistance grew. The Soviets fought from the basements, from the ruins, from the sewers. The Volga, which glistened behind the city, became both lifeline and tomb. Soviet reinforcements crossed it under fire, rowing through waves of bullets and flames. Those who made it to the western bank fought until death, knowing there would be no retreat. For the Germans, the battle became something grotesque. There were no front lines, only chaos. Battles were fought for single staircases, for corridors, for rooms. One day a building was German, the next day Soviet. Snipers stalked the ruins, their rifles echoing in the silence between artillery blasts. Men killed each other with knives, with shovels, with bare hands. The city was no longer a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse. The soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. By October, the Sixth Army had taken most of the city, but at a terrible price. Thousands were dead, ammunition was running low, and still the Soviets refused to surrender. They held small pockets of resistance along the Volga, fighting like ghosts amid the ruins. The Germans joked bitterly that Stalingrad had ceased to exist, that they were fighting over shadows. Then, the snow came again. While the Germans clawed for the last ruins of the city, far behind their lines, the Red Army was preparing something vast. In November 1942, under the gray dawn of winter, the Soviet counterattack began. From the north and south, two massive fronts surged forward, crushing the weak Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the flanks. Within days, the trap closed. At first, they refused to believe it. Paulus assured Berlin that the situation was under control. Hitler, upon hearing of the encirclement, laughed. "They will hold," he said. "The Luftwaffe will supply them. The Sixth Army will not yield an inch." But it was all a lie. The airlift that Göring promised could never succeed. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, the weather brutal, the Soviet fighters merciless. The few planes that managed to land brought too little, too late. Sacks of bread, tins of fuel, bullets that froze in crates. The soldiers waited in the snow for supplies that never came. Inside the city, hunger turned men into shadows. Horses were eaten first, then dogs, then rats, then the leather of boots. In the cellars, men huddled beside corpses for warmth. The dead outnumbered the living. Disease spread. Frostbite turned fingers black. Paulus sent desperate messages to Berlin. "We are surrounded, supplies exhausted, request permission to break out." But the reply from Hitler was cold and final. "The Sixth Army will stand and fight. Surrender is forbidden." So they stood. Through December and January, the encircled army withered. Soviet artillery pounded them day and night. Every factory, every ruin, every bunker became a tomb. Men froze where they stood, rifles still clutched in stiff hands. The cries of the wounded echoed through the ruins, unanswered. The Soviets tightened the noose slowly, methodically. They knew their enemy was starving. They waited, encircling like wolves. In January 1943, the final Soviet assault began. Tanks rolled through the shattered streets. The once proud German divisions were now skeletons in gray. Some fought until their last bullet. Others surrendered, hands shaking from hunger. Entire units simply vanished into the white fog. On February 2, 1943, silence fell over Stalingrad. The last radio message from the German Sixth Army crackled through static. "The fighting has ceased. The Sixth Army is dead." Of the 300,000 men who had marched into the city, only 90,000 were taken prisoner. The rest lay buried beneath the ruins, beneath the snow, beneath the pride that had sent them there. Of those prisoners, barely 5,000 would ever see Germany again. When news reached Berlin, the Reich trembled. For the first time, even the propaganda could not mask the truth. Stalingrad was no victory. It was annihilation. Hitler raged in his bunker, refusing to accept responsibility. He blamed his generals, his allies, his soldiers, anyone but himself. Yet, deep down, he knew the truth. The invincible army of Germany had been broken, not by the Soviets alone, but by its own arrogance. In the streets of Berlin, the women wept. In the factories, the workers lowered their eyes. In the barracks, the soldiers spoke in hushed tones. The myth of the superhuman German army, the machine that conquered Europe, was dead. And the world had seen it die. The Reich still had men, still had weapons, still had hope. But something essential had been lost at Stalingrad. The spirit that once believed itself destined to rule had been crushed beneath the rubble of a city that refused to fall. The Germans had believed they could master the world through willpower, discipline, and fear. In Stalingrad, they discovered that willpower could freeze, discipline could starve, and fear could turn inward until it devoured itself. From that moment on, the German war was no longer a conquest. It was a slow, inevitable collapse. The overconfidence that had once carried them across Europe now dragged them toward destruction. The pride that had promised glory now whispered only of doom. And as winter gave way to spring, and the ruins of Stalingrad smoldered under the thawing snow, one truth was clear: the war had changed forever. The Reich could never recover from the wound it had inflicted upon itself. The smoke of Stalingrad hung over the Reich like a curse. It was not merely a military defeat, it was the breaking of a spell. For years, the German people had believed in their own invincibility, in the myth of a destiny carved in steel and fire. Now, whispers spread through every village and every garrison. The Führer is not infallible. The soldiers returning from the east were no longer the iron stormtroopers of the early war. They were gray-faced, trembling from hunger and frostbite, eyes hollowed by the things they'd seen. They carried not trophies, but ghosts. The ghosts of comrades left in the frozen steppe, the faces of enemies who refused to die. Berlin pretended nothing had changed. Hitler appeared before cheering crowds, his voice still thunderous, his gestures still grand. He promised vengeance, victory, renewal. But behind closed doors, the walls of the Reich Chancellery echoed with arguments and fear. Generals murmured that the Eastern Front could no longer be held. The factories could not replace the tanks lost. The people could not bear another winter of rationing and loss. Yet the Führer refused to yield an inch. The man who had once outmaneuvered nations now fought reality itself. He issued orders that ignored geography, logic, and humanity. "No retreat," he screamed. "German soil will not be abandoned." Every town became a fortress, every road a line to die upon. Whole divisions were thrown into battles that no longer made sense, sacrifices to pride. In the East, the Red Army gathered strength like a storm. The Soviets had learned from their wounds. They rebuilt, they adapted, they came back stronger. Their factories in the Urals worked night and day, spitting out tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them. For every village lost, the Russians took 3 back. In the West, another shadow began to form. The Allies, regrouping across the Channel, arming, waiting. By 1943, the war had become a tide, and that tide had turned. The Germans still fought bravely, still skillfully. No one could deny their discipline. But bravery without purpose is despair in uniform. The soldiers no longer fought for glory. They fought to survive, to delay the inevitable. The air war over Germany brought the truth home. The Allied bombers came in endless waves, B-17s and Lancasters, their engines droning like the voice of doom. City after city burned: Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden. The night sky glowed red, and the air itself seemed to weep. Women and children huddled in basements while the firestorms raged above. Entire neighborhoods were consumed in minutes. The sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. The Reich's mighty industry, once its pride, was now a landscape of ashes. But even as cities burned, Hitler's voice grew harsher. In his underground headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, then later the Berlin Bunker, he ranted at maps covered in red pins. He moved imaginary divisions across the table, convinced of victories that existed only in his mind. His generals watched in silence, knowing that to question him meant ruin. One by one, the men who had built the early victories vanished, dismissed, disgraced, or dead. Field Marshal Manstein, who had tried to save the Eastern Front with cunning maneuvers, was ignored. Rommel, the Desert Fox, now fought in Italy, defending ruins instead of capturing glory. Even the people began to suspect that their Führer had lost touch with reality. Still, resistance to him was unthinkable. The Gestapo made sure of that. Dissent was death. The walls had ears, the air had spies. And so, Germany marched toward its doom in silence. The Eastern Front was now a nightmare. The Red Army's offensive in 1944, Operation Bagration, shattered the German lines completely. Whole armies were swallowed by the steppe. The retreat turned into a rout. For the first time, German soldiers fled west, not to attack, but to escape. Villages that had once cheered their arrival now spat at them. They saw the truth in the eyes of the civilians: fear, hatred, revenge. The atrocities committed in the early days of the invasion had returned to haunt them tenfold. The east was burning, and the fire was spreading westward. In Italy, the Allies advanced through mountains and blood. In France, the resistance grew restless, waiting. The Germans fortified the Atlantic Wall, convinced that it would hold forever. But the sea, like history, cannot be held back by concrete. On June 6, 1944, the Allies came. Normandy erupted in thunder. The beaches ran red, and German machine guns raked the sand. But still, the Allies came. By the end of the summer, Paris was free. The Western Front had opened, and the Reich was trapped between 2 crushing giants. Inside Germany, despair took root. Food was scarce. Fuel was gone. Trains no longer brought soldiers home, only coffins. The people listened to the distant rumble of artillery and knew the war was coming to them. Hitler's overconfidence, once a weapon, was now a poison. He believed in miracles, in secret weapons that would turn the tide. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the wonder weapons promised by his scientists. They did little but prolong the agony. By late 1944, the Reich was collapsing from within. The Allies closed in from the west, the Soviets from the east. The once proud Wehrmacht was reduced to boys and old men, the Volkssturm. They fought with Panzerfausts and desperation, defending streets they'd never leave again. And still, Hitler refused to surrender. He forbade retreat, forbade negotiation, forbade reason. "The German people have failed me," he told his inner circle. "If the war is lost, they deserve to perish." Those words marked the final transformation from leader to destroyer. The empire that had once dreamed of 1,000 years now barely had 1,000 hours left. In the ruins of Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna, the echoes of German boots were fading. The songs of victory were replaced by the cries of the displaced, the widowed, the damned. The Reich, once the mightiest force in Europe, was now a bleeding carcass devoured by its own pride. And as the Allies crossed the Rhine and the Soviets closed on Berlin, a cold wind blew through the corridors of power. The men who had once spoken of destiny now whispered of escape. The myth was dead. The gods of war had turned their faces away. Germany's overconfidence had not merely led to defeat, it had led to destruction, total, absolute, and deserved. The empire built on arrogance was dying, not with glory, but with silence and ash.